Welcome to the Demonstrating Implementation Excellence stream of SNOMED CT Expo 2023. My name is Nick Egerhaus, and I'm the Global Vendor Engagement Lead and Customer Relations Executive for the Middle East and Africa at SNOMED International. I'll be moderating today's session. All questions will be answered at the conclusion of the presentation. Online attendees, please use the Q&A button to type your questions to the presenter. On-site attendees, please use the microphone provided in the room. I'm now pleased to introduce Feikje Hielkema from NICTIS, who will be presenting terminology bindings in clinical building blocks. Theory hits practice, practice hits back. Feikje, please go ahead.
Well, thank you. So I was quite tickled to find out that this presentation was part of the Implementation Excellence stream because it's more of an implementation bloopers kind of thing. And if anyone's curious about that subtitle there, I borrowed it from this great science fiction series by Lois McMaster Buchholz. And anyone who thinks that both books can be funny and thrilling and science fiction at once should definitely go and read that. Right, so I'm going to tell you a bit about how we've made terminology bindings for clinical building blocks in the Netherlands and what we've learned from that. And in order to get to the meat of the presentation, I will first have to set the scene by telling you a bit about our organization and what clinical building blocks actually are. So first, who are we? I've been working, I'm a computational linguist by background, but I've been working at NICTIS for 10 years now as a terminologist, together with my colleague, Else de Groot, who has actually been working there for 14 years. And this is important because it means we've been around long enough to be confronted with the results of our own daft mistakes. So, what is NICTIS? Well, we're the Competence Center for Digital Information Management in Healthcare for the Netherlands. Most of you just know us as the National Release Center for SNOMED in the Netherlands, but that's just 8 people in a sea of 200 lost souls, all dealing with healthcare information standards. So, what do we do? Well, most of us, about 130 of us, develop information standards, which are use case driven. We all believe, that appropriate availability of healthcare information plays a vital role in improving people's health. And our motto is better health through better information. But we do have different focus for that. We do have different backgrounds. And that's sometimes makes things work out just slightly different than we thought it would. So, what are clinical building blocks? So more than 100 people of us are working on use case driven information standards, but there's also a team, roughly the same size as the terminology team, that works on clinical building blocks. And those building blocks really are about how to make sure that information gets modeled the same way across different information standards. So our common goal is to reuse healthcare information during healthcare episodes. And that requires agreement about the information and how it should be shared. Those standards should be implemented, and healthcare professionals have to learn how to use them. If you just go about creating these use case-driven information standards, what you end up is with every information standard, the same information gets modeled in different ways. And you actually end up with 10 different ways to model a patient's information, as in first name, surname, and address. Clinical building blocks try to amend that by specifying a standard way of this is the information that I would expect to know about a patient or a lab result. And that makes them essential for semantic unification. So they take a piece of information from the healthcare process and they just describe and define that. So if I have a lab result, what do I need to know about the method, about the specimen, about the container, etc. So if you think this all seems very familiar, it kind of reminds me of open air or fire resources. You're absolutely correct, of course. But we started this as an organization 10 years ago, and in fact, we're really busy looking at right now as an organization how it ties up with these newer developments and make sure that we will adhere to the actual international standards. But that's all beyond the scope of this particular presentation, because I'm just going to talk about mistakes that we've made in the past and how not to make them in the future. So clinical building blocks are meant to be building blocks for information standards, like Lego. And if you think this is selling information standards short, just remember that Lego scales vary enormously, whereas I could only build chunky houses as a child. My brother-in-law managed to build an entire medieval town, including an incredibly convincing cathedral. So there is an art to combining them. So an information standard would generally consist of a number of clinical building blocks for the generic concepts that would be relevant for this domain and reusable across the healthcare domain. But they can be tailored to specific use cases. So for instance, if you've got a value set, you can shrink it to fit your domain or extend it. Also, an information standard will contain some domain-specific concepts which aren't covered by the clinical building blocks because they're not actually applicable to all healthcare. So you can add an additional element, or you can add relations between clinical building blocks, or you can actually add elements that the clinical building blocks didn't contain before. And an information standard may even contain other fields that, that weren't in the building blocks to start with. And thus you end up with something that's tailored to your use case, but still, where you can, you're being consistent, and it makes it much easier to implement and use. So what does that look like? Well, for people who like this kind of pictures, we've got a schematic overview here of the allergy intolerance clinical building block. And much as Heather showed us, this has separate fields for the causative agent and for the severity of the reaction, etc. Now those elements you combine to a value set that will give you a list of options to choose from for a particular field. Okay, oh, going too fast there. No, never mind. So that's what a clinical building block is meant to be. They should be reused across information standards. And that means that if you change something, no matter how tiny it is, you will affect multiple information standards. So the consequences of a tiny change may in fact be huge and affect many, many people in your country. Worse, often these clinical building blocks have a strong link to the user interface. I'm not saying that's necessarily how it should be, but it is kind of the way they end up being implemented. And that means that if you change something, the software vendor is going to be impacted. He has to change the software, and the end user is actually going to see this and have to change their behavior. So it's not something you want to do lightly. You have to think real carefully before you change a clinical building block. A small change can be a breaking change with large consequences. As an example, there was a gender identity value set. I'm sure anyone who reads these newspapers realizes that in the past 10 years that had to be extended from male or female to rather more options. But that's actually visible in the user interface, and patient information is used in every single information standard we have. So that's a huge change there. Now, because these things are so difficult to change, while our most recent version was published in 2022, last year, the more forward of our healthcare organizations are implementing the 2020 version, but actually many organizations are, as we speak, trying to implement the 2017 version. Just think that 6 years ago, there was no pandemic then. The whole situation was entirely different, but that's what we're stuck with right now. And if they're only implementing it now, it means they'll still be stuck with it 3 years from now. So, oh yes, and finally, a clinical building block version. So one that where all the clinical building blocks are gathered together, that's a coherent entity. So you can't mix building blocks from different versions. You can't say, oh, I want to update the gender identity thing, but I don't want to change the rest. It's not an option. So takeaway message here. The ideal clinical building block never changes, but the ideal terminology is dynamic, always in flux, because things change and so does terminology. We get different new drugs every month, we get new pathogens, we get new techniques, and users do not actually want to wait a full decade before they can register them. Just imagine if you had to wait until 2027 to register your first positive COVID test. So users demand these new terms ASAP, but they also need a static clinical building block. So what we need is a kind of a clinical building block cliff that will withstand the changing tide of terminology. How does that work? How do you use a new SNOMED code in a standard that's 5 or 10 years old? So how do we combine these static and dynamic things and make them work together? Well, that's easy. That's what terminology binding is for. So I'm going to focus here on value sets. So code systems, they define concepts, as we know, and we give them meaning. They give them meaning through formal definitions. A value set specifies a set of codes from a code system that can be used for a specific context. And then a terminology binding is what you use to apply a value set to a dataset element and specify rules around the use of it. In our clinical building blocks, we have used 4 different ways to create a value set, and I'm going to tell you about all 4 of them. About how we thought they should work in theory and about how we found out what actually happened in practice over the past 10 years. So the first one is traditional, it's the HL7 value set. So this is just a list that's actually part of the clinical building block specification that just tells you, in this case, if you want to measure blood pressure, these are the 5 body positions the patient can take. Now this value set is just as static as your clinical building block. It's easy to implement. Everyone knows how to implement this. Drawback, if one of these concepts gets retired next month, it can happen any month, I can't change it. It's just there until a new version is published. And that's when you realize these things have to last for 10 years, kind of a large drawback. Also, it's a bit hard to extend, going back to the gender identity set. So, not ideal, we thought. So, we had a bright idea. We figured we'd use an extensional SNOMED reference set. So a SNOMED reference set, a hand-picked set that was updated with each version of SNOMED that we publish. Still easy to implement because these sets are published within the RF2 as a whole list of codes. So you can just go to SNOMED and retrieve the list of codes that you should be implementing. It does require us to maintain this manually, which means we also need someone to authorize it and tell us what to go into it. And some party needs to tell us, well, which microorganisms in this case do you want to be in there? Not that trivial a job. The first version contained 3,000 concepts and the current version contains 4,500 concepts. So, but at least it can be updated with every new SNOMED release, and that's an advantage. That way, we've got the SARS coronavirus 2 in there, which you wouldn't have if we just created a version from 2017. So in theory, this is a great idea, but this is where practice reared up and smacked theory in the face. Because what actually happened is that vendors implemented a static copy. Instead of updating the reference set with each new SNOMED release, they just implemented a static copy. And you go, oh dear, those vendors, they never get it right. But actually, it turned out that their own colleagues from the information standards were telling them that this was the correct behavior. They were saying, oh, but that information standard depends on the SNOMED version of 2017, so that's what you should be using. We hadn't seen that coming at all. So, rather unfortunate consequence, which has taught us to communicate better. So, another option we've been using is the ECL query, because, like I said, with the reference set, you need to maintain that. You need someone to tell you what goes into that. But sometimes, or oftentimes, you don't really have any idea. For instance, the morphology code list, a list of all kinds of morphologic abnormalities. We don't really have an organization that tells us for the whole of the Netherlands what kind of morphological abnormalities they actually want to code. So what we do, we put an ECL query instead. It's kind of a placeholder. This is meant to be reused across healthcare, and if you create an information standard for people who actually do know what set they want to use, they can refine it, no problem. So ECL queries, they require little maintenance. You just put them in once, never look at it again. And they're a placeholder for terminology work in process, which can be very useful. But they're not easy to implement at all. You need to be able to parse ECL. Most people don't. This is why the Netherlands now hosts a national terminology server to actually help vendors to do this. Otherwise, it wouldn't happen. Worse, the query, if one of the concepts gets retired, that query breaks. It doesn't work anymore. Your expansion will be 0. But if it's in there for the next 10 years, that's a huge problem. So you can mitigate that by making sure that you use only concepts which are very durable. For instance, matching what is in the machine readable concept model. If you use the range of an attribute, odds are it's not going to get retired in the next 10 years. That does land you, however, with things like the collection method code list, where you're allowed to register any procedure you like, including implantation of hip prosthesis or referral to the dentist. And if you try to be more specific, you run the risk of things like the container type code list, where we used specimen container, which seemed really useful, but actually I'm just in the process of working on a proposal myself, which, among other things, proposes to retire that particular concept because it's actually kind of the same as a container. So that's going to be a problem several years from now. So basically, this approach is asking for trouble unless you're very, very careful. The final method we used is an intentional SNOMED reference set. That's a reference set that is defined by an ECL query. So with each new SNOMED release, you publish the expansion of that query. Makes it easier to use because it looks for the end user just the same as an extensional reference set. This again requires little maintenance because it's just the same as the ECL query. And at least if the query breaks, you have the option of changing the defining query and keeping the reference set going. However, we have one instance of these and it's failed spectacularly because we had this idea of an allergen reference set. We just showed you the clinical building block for allergy intolerance. We needed a reference set that says, well, these are the substances that can cause an allergic reaction. We don't want to put every single substance that's in SNOMED in there. That's way too much. But hey, SNOMED has an allergen class concept. Let's use that. We'll just define an intentional reference set, and then meanwhile, we can work with the allergologists on an extensional reference set and publish that a few years from now. And then SNOMED International went and retired allergen class. And they didn't specify a replacement because there's no defining an allergen in SNOMED. So that was it for our reference set. We had to kill it. We had to say this is retired because we have no content for this. And that was our second mistake, because what we should have done was to create or to replace the contents just to make it extensional. But we didn't. We retired it and said, oh, it's replaced by this other extensional reference set, which is fine, which is maintained by the Scientific Association for Allergology. But that concept's still in the clinical building blocks 2017. And we got a lot of flack from this about this last year, people saying, well, we can't implement this. What's going on? You retired it, but it's being used. Eventually, what we did was actually resurrect this and fill it with the contents of the extensional reference set, which is a horrible hack, but it was the only way forward that we could see. So again, this method is kind of vulnerable to changes in the query concepts. And of course, all the methods I've shown, except from the first, all suffer from that same problem that vendors implement a static copy. Whether you use a query or an intentional reference set or an intentional reference set, if they implement a static copy, you can devote lots of thought and care into keeping your ref sets up to date, but it's not going to actually end up being used. So, what do we learn from this? Well, I divided our lessons learned into two parts, really. And one of them, okay. One of them is that what we need to communicate better, not just to to the vendors or the end users, but actually to our own colleagues as well. All stakeholders should be aware that regular updates of the terminology are essential to high quality data registration. And that may seem like an obvious message to everyone in the room, but it turned out that it was quite a new message to a lot of our close colleagues who are just as dedicated as us to promoting healthcare information. Theory isn't practice unless you tell practice very clearly what the theory should be. So extrapolating a clinical building block cannot be dependent on a particular version of SNOMED. You have to reiterate this message because that's actually new information to a lot of people. And so a reference set or a query expansion should be updated whenever a new SNOMED release is available. If you have implemented your information standard once, you can't stop there. Every time a new SNOMED version becomes available, which is in the Netherlands at the moment twice a year and will be every month soon, you need to update it. And finally, because not all organizations, it's never going to happen that all organizations update at exactly the same time. So you need to have an agreement in place on how do you deal with a concept that is obsolete because the sender is using an older version of SNOMED than you are, and also what will happen if you receive a concept that you don't know because the sender is on a new version. Everyone's going to have to face one of these challenges. So you have to have agreements in place on how you deal with that. Then there's the guidelines for terminologists. So, and that's just, it all boils down to think before you act. If you create something as a placeholder, if you have a bright idea that it turns out to be ill-conceived, it turns into a millstone that you will carry for the next decade if you're working with clinical building blocks. So be careful. Remind yourself that what you create, the reference set or the query, it must have the lifespan that is at least as long as the standard you designed it for. And if you put your name to it, it makes you responsible for it, and it implies that you have actually devoted some care to its contents. So think carefully and make sure that you have a long-term capacity for maintenance. Some other messages, don't be overly specific. If you're designing something that's meant to be used across healthcare, don't make a very specific list, because you will never get all the specialisms that will have to use it around the table. Be more generic rather than too specific. Once it's out there, every separate domain can then tailor it to their own requirements. And finally, if you're working in an extension, promote your concepts. Because for one thing, we're going to have to be exchanging across borders, especially if you're in Europe, and that's kind of difficult if you're only using concepts from your own extension. And also, if you don't promote your concepts, every new international release, you will have to retire some of them because someone else managed to get them into SNOMED. And that creates concept churn, which is difficult for the standards. So to decrease the likelihood of having to inactivate everything, just promote it. Finally, simply boils down to don't do as we say. Do as we say, but don't do as we did.
Thanks, Feikje. We'll now take questions. As a reminder, if you're in the room, please use the microphone that's in the middle aisle there. I think we have time for one quick question. Do you want to use the microphone?
Hi, Feikje. I'm having the question, on which criteria you decide whether to define an intentional set, an extensional set, or a query? Because we are all in favor in our terminology center to use query-based reference sets. But if you look at the practice, they all more in favor of using extensional reference sets, which we are trying to avoid as much as possible.
Well, I think you should only create an extensional reference set if you've got an organization that is capable of determining what goes into it. And capable means they have the knowledge, the authority, and the resources. And it has to be long-term, because it has to. So what we do at NICT is we set up an agreement that actually says which party is supposed to authorize those reference sets, to make sure we don't get stuck with an impossible job of trying to maintain something without having the actual knowledge to do it. But like I showed you, each version has its own drawbacks. So I think it's a matter of being aware of what the drawbacks, looking at the situation, and then determining the best approach.
Okay, thank you.
I think that is all we have time for. Thanks, Feikje.